All right, we are now joined by Rick Franzblau, Assistant Athletic Director of Olympic Sports Performance here at Clemson University. First and foremost, thanks so much for taking the time this morning. I just kind of first want to understand what your philosophy is in kind of building up athletes when it comes to baseball, which is such a specific sport when it comes to movement.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of uniqueness in baseball in that, I could look at outfielders and I can have, 5'8", I can have 6'4", and I think that's what really, alters and changes our player development philosophy, so much more so in baseball versus if I go watch the Olympics in swimming and it's the 100 freestyles. I look across the platform, all 8 of those swimmers are going to look almost exactly the same. The only thing that's different is their swim caps, right? But in baseball, there's a lot of uniqueness to structure, which that helps us a lot in terms of our lens of evaluating players, evaluating their movement, and ultimately our philosophy is working backwards from the game. So ultimately, bat path, ball flight, ball flight for a pitcher, pitch arsenal, goes back to how the body moves. The body creates that bat path. The body creates that ball flight out of the pitcher's hands. And so we have to kind of work backwards from that in the game to then understand what are we doing in the weight room, what are we doing from a movement perspective. So the movement affects the movement on the mound, the movement in the box or on the field, and ultimately affects bat path, ball flight, and those types of things. But actually working backwards from that is kind of the process that we subscribe to.
So because you're kind of trying to work backwards and like you said, athletes have so many different body types, how much like assessment do you do? How many times are you checking in with them? What's that process kind of look like? Because I'm assuming you're having to collect a lot of data and checking and rechecking to build your process.
Certainly not easy, especially, in college tend to have larger rosters. So usually at the beginning of the year, we do our comprehensive assessment. So a lot of table tests, a lot of complex movements. We'll get our players into the lab, so motion capture, kinetics and kinematics. Our analytics group, which I also oversee, we'll look at ball flight, all our KPIs, offensive for hitters and for our pitchers as well. And that'll kind of paint the picture of who you are, why you're successful, why you're not successful in certain areas. And then from that, as we kind of work through the process, we try and distill that down to a couple KPIs. So if we're talking about the movement stuff, and maybe a standing rotation or maybe a hip width crossover toe touch or something, that I have one movement KPI that ultimately I've distilled this down to that we can check at any point during the session before an outing or something like that, that helps us kind of have continuity throughout this process without having to do the comprehensive deal all the time. We'll do that 3 or 4 times a year, but we try and distill that down to a couple things that are more repeatable throughout the entire course of a off-season, in-season, post-season type scenario.
How often are you seeing, within the course of a season, because it's a long, 9 months where you're with these guys from fall into the competition season, how often are you seeing guys like movement patterns potentially changing? Because I would imagine just through workload, it changes naturally.
Yeah.
They're lifting, they're going through practice every day, pitchers, bullpens, guys are getting a bunch of swings every day, but then you're also adjusting movement patterns. So how big of a scale is that on how much guys, like their movement patterns are changing throughout a year?
Oh yeah, quite a bit. And that's really what's helpful with having Newt Force and our motion capture system is we are able to distill that down and dive at a more granular level to look at those types of things. But you got to think too, between what they're doing in the game, what they're doing in the weight room, is we're constantly battling 2 things, our gravity, external forces, and also internal forces. So there's torque and movement within our organs and our digestive system that kind of pushes us right to left, that we're always countering that, usually left side pushing forward. But that process and how we solve that changes over time. That changes within, week to week, months, throughout a player's career in college or as they go college to pro. So that's why going back to the initial assessment is so important you understand the starting conditions, okay? And I think maybe the most important thing in player development is understanding the why, okay? So when somebody's at their best, why? And if you have a better lens of understanding movement and understanding what that looks like at their best, you're going to more likely be able to stay in that kind of sphere of when they're at their absolute best. Or when they're not, is kind of understanding what elements are kind of have changed for the worse and understanding that process moving forward.
Walk me through the process of kind of individualizing a program like that for so many guys on a roster, because I would imagine it's a lot of detailed work, and each guy also has to understand what's important for them that day. So what's that process like for you?
Yeah, it's definitely tough. Takes a while. So usually with our older guys, they've been to the program. We understand their bodies better. We'll kind of get into the minutia a little bit more. With the younger guys, we go through our initial assessments. We throw them in the lab. We kind of want to see them perform through their first fall to kind of understand, what are strategies we need to drive deeper and further. What are some things we need to change and stuff like that. So part of it kind of is where you are through your process and our program and understanding you. But a lot of it will also be bucketing. So especially in the weight room when we're getting to compound main lifts, stuff like that is, it's hard to have, 20 guys doing 12 different things. Okay. But if I have guys doing 5 different things, okay, that's more manageable from a coaching perspective, from a programming. And then what we try and distill really down to the individual is a lot of their movement stuff, pre, post, things like that is really specific to them. But I think the most important thing, and I really implore our guys a lot, is to ask questions. Like, especially if we're going to do some really detail-oriented stuff with the bodies, they got to understand the why, right? If they're going to fully commit and buy into this process, we have to do a hell of a job educating them. So really a lot of our initial onboarding is assessment, but also me educating the guys on why we're doing this type of stuff and what their presentations are. And guys we've worked with that have been similar, that are solving similar type problems. That's ultimately what you're after in player development, is building models to enhance your probabilities. Nobody's going to get everything right, and we still make mistakes, but our job is to connect as many variables to similar situations we've either done well or not as well in the past, but learn from success or failure. And then that provides a better route for us moving forward with each individual player.
And then what's it like from, how are you managing strength and then, durability and even like we talk about movement and flexibility? Kind of how do you weigh that and what guys or what part of the year are we working on what, or what guys need to work on that day?
Yeah.
How do you kind of manage those 3 factors that are all important?
Yeah, great question. I think a lot of it goes back to kind of their individual structure and understanding them on the mound or them as a hitter. So if I have a wider thorax, denser type individual, they're going to kind of rotate on this type of helical pattern, right? So we can kind of look at their movement as kind of like the shallow half pipe right here, right? If I have somebody long, tall cylinder, right, they're going to move more on this helix. So they're going to have kind of this steeper type half pipe, right? So if I just think about a pitcher, okay, big, wider type dude, okay, with a more space in the middle of that half pipe, that's kind of my force producing, kind of like my linear phase, right? Versus a super narrow type pitcher, okay, that may get up tall, create a lot of counter rotation, but they're actually not creating this massive force production kind of in the middle of that half pipe. So that's kind of where we start with, and understanding that and like, how are they creating the momentum? So we may have some guys where it's all center mass acceleration, rear leg impulse, right? And they tend to have very good transfer from, lunges, squats, deadlifts, those types of things in the weight room, right? Where some of these tall, narrow, skinny guys, okay, because they just kind of have a little space in that half pipe to kind of stay in this linear phase and delay trunk rotation. They got to find a way to make that force production really strong in a short period, or bend the half pipe. So how do they bend the half pipe? Okay, that's a spinal turn, that's a coil, moves like that. So that helps us understand, how we prescribe in the weight room too, okay? To which guy is strength going to translate more so than others. And in most instances it all does, okay? But for varying degrees, for varying amounts of time, if that makes sense. So it's particularly the tall, skinny pitcher, okay, that's got to bend their half pipe and all that. You got to really understand the intricacies of their body and how they're kind of buying time to stay close, because they don't have this big window of pelvis shape to push in the ground. The other factor is lever length too. So we look at a lot of, I think mechanical load is something important to look at in the weight room. So that's gonna be force over distance. So say I have a 6'5" pitcher who does a lunge with 365 pounds, and I have a 5'9", does a lunge with say 275. And I have a 5'9" pitcher who does the same lunge with 335 pounds. They may actually do the same amount of mechanical work. That makes sense?
Yes.
So that plays a lot into our lever systems and on the mound or in the batter's box in terms of creating momentum and velocity, right? So that's something we look at a lot, and that's where also, like, you know, that 5'9" guy, and probably, you know, when you're looking at actual just weight, they're moving in the weight room, to create the mechanical work, it's probably going to have to be pretty high, right? But that also goes back to kind of their strategy of how they're producing energy in the batter's box or on the mound.
Does it change too with like kind of the functionality of what you're doing with them sport specific wise? Like, are you doing a lot more, you know, for the taller guys, is it having to be a lot more one-legged in the weight room, where shorter guys it's different, or for everybody it's like, hey, you play this sport on one leg, we need you to be able to rotate powerfully? How does that kind of change between the different body types?
Yeah, a great question. I think it does change a good bit. You know, if the wider I am, tend to be the better I can hinge and I can push my hips posterior. It's just the shape of my pelvis. So those guys tend to do well with deadlifts or, you know, squatting to 90 degrees and things like that. Okay, a lot of our tall, skinny cylinders tend to do better with a lot of the single leg type movements, but they can also do well with like a higher box squat and stuff like that. But and we don't work in absolutes either, right? Again, it's working backwards from how do they move on the mound. Like, I got a tall, skinny guy with a super narrow pelvis. They're going to pressurize well. A lot of those guys don't drop as deep into their back leg, right? So I may not need to be deep squatting those guys, but they have to be really strong in kind of these ranges just above, or be able to create the appropriate impulse to handle their momentum dropping. So that's where a lot of these things kind of help us connect the dots of understanding what to do with each guy.
I'm curious about how freshmen can kind of adjust to the everyday grind of the college schedule. What are some of the kind of the pitfalls and hurdles that young guys, when they come in with their body and the adjustments that they have to make when they first get here?
Yeah. You certainly see all types of backgrounds and experiences. So that's one of the first things we do. We get to know them, obviously, through the recruiting process, but we do obviously a very thorough assessment, but also a thorough intake too. So in terms of their training history, movements they like, things that, you know, are contraindicated based off injuries they've had, also throwing wise, what's normal for them in terms of volume, time of year, how long, you know, how much of the year do they throw, those types of things. So that gives us a better framework of kind of what they've done. And then you get guys that have not a ton of experience, guys that have a ton, somewhere in between. So that, combined with the assessment, we take them through our basic progressions. And it's not like we go through the assessment and we understand everything about them, right? So part of it is as we go through our initial progressions and teaching models, is we get to learn more and more about their body and understand how they're moving, which kind of helps us divert energy into certain exercises or methodologies that kind of help us progress them moving forward. But we slow cook it, okay? Early on, so they learn the foundational principles and can kind of move efficiently, and then can start to add more, you know, load when we need to with certain guys. But slow cook it, educate the hell out of them. But a lot of times I see this, guys that are either kind of underprepared from a physical perspective, which I'd rather see that, because guess what? It's pretty freaking easy to get somebody bigger and stronger, right? In this type of setting, with what they have access to, nutrition education, those types of things. The situation that's more challenging is I have a guy that had to sell out like crazy in the weight room to achieve certain outputs when they're 18 years old, that now those strategies are actually providing diminishing returns, and we got to do a pretty big pivot. Like they've driven deeper attractor strategies that more energy had to be put into, that's going to be harder to kind of pull them out of that if there's an instant switch set. So I actually kind of like the guy that's undertrained a little bit. We can kind of mold them, and it's easy to get somebody bigger and stronger.
Have there ever been any instances where, because you mentioned slow cooking it, have there ever been instances where you've gotten a guy in, you put him down a path, and his body changes so much from that first path that you guys put him on that you now have to pivot pretty quick because it's like, oh, he's changed dramatically since he first got here in his first year?
Yeah, definitely. So, you take a tall, skinny pitcher that, you're adding some strength, some muscle mass and all that, and they may do it fairly quickly, and, they got long levers and can add weight pretty quickly. Then that's when we go back to the new force in the lab and look at those types of things to where, we may have to pivot a little bit. So here's a big thing we look at is like momentum. Okay, you're trying to create momentum on the mound. Okay, kind of your proxy in the weight room. You look at jump momentum, which is mass times velocity. So, as I'm increasing mass, okay, generally speaking, if I can also increase velocity, I'm going to increase momentum a ton. Okay. If I increase mass but keep velocity the same, I'm still getting those. But if I increase mass and now I have a drop in velocity, okay, that may be a potential pivot point looking at those. But what matters most is the momentum on here, right? And it's momentum that's transferred from rear leg to front leg. And also it goes back to what we were talking earlier is we have rear leg loaders, we have front leg loaders, those types of things, which play an important role in terms of understanding what I'm after in the weight room as well, too.
I'm glad you've mentioned the Newt Force mount in that last answer. You've talked several times about working backwards with these guys. Mm-hmm. What advantages, just to start here, does the Newt Force mount give you guys in being able to kind of assess and diagnose what guys need?
Yeah, I just kind of hit on it a little bit before. It's like, in terms of their energy production, are they more of a rear leg? Are they more of a front leg type guy? Are they a guy that kind of loads to the back leg well and transfers it really well to the front leg? Then you're really working with something, right? But kind of understanding that and educating the guys on that and being able to track that. And I mean, we can do our pitching Coach Bellinger's in here with the guys on it weekly, and then being able to relate that back to the weight room helps us get guys to buy into certain movements and say, hey, this is something we really got to load, keep getting stronger with, or hey, this is something where, the load's not the important thing, it's how we capture the energy when we do it for you individually is the most important thing. That kind of goes back to the N of one player development philosophy. Everybody is their own unique experiment. That's what this helps us with, is being able to look at the individual, understand why they're successful, and then help that tap into the training program and the education.
How much does a mound like this and ground force in general, and then movement tying into stuff you do in the weight room, help with injury prevention?
Yeah.
Because I think what a lot of people think about when they see a Newt Force mound or a lab or think of strength training, they're just chasing stuff, they're chasing abilities, but injury prevention is kind of above all that stuff, because if you're not healthy, it doesn't matter how good you are, right?
Yeah, and I think, that's a low-hanging fruit oftentimes is lower half kinetics, right? And ground forces helps us time up trunk rotation, okay, the flip of the arm, those types of things. We also have our camera system. We see as guys get cleaner with that lower half, as things improve kinematically in the upper body, help us kind of get into better positions to kind of distribute load through the arm as we release it. So that's where this is just incredibly helpful, and also helps us educate the players too, because we can show them in the lab setting and then transfer that back to, hey, this is why we're kind of working on this in the weight room as well too. And understanding too, and this is where I had to pivot in my philosophies a lot, because we didn't have this, but I was understanding there were certain guys I was getting stronger, but it wasn't translating, right? It wasn't, we didn't have it at the time, but you kind of tell the kinetics weren't improving in what matters, which is actually on the mound, right? So that's where this has just been so critical to changing our philosophy, but also our methods and how we educate guys as well too.
Creating rotational force and then rotational speed, is there a correlation between which one translates better for baseball, or does it just really all depend on the body type? Like, hey, this guy, if he rotates faster, he's going to be better. This guy needs to produce more force to be better. Is there kind of like a 1 + 1 = 2 there, or is it really just kind of individually?
Yeah, I think very individual, and that's where the kind of different force vectors are helpful on the Newt Force. But if I have a kind of a low slot, kind of sinker slider type guy, they're going to rely on a lot of trunk rotation velocity, right? I have kind of a north-south arsenal type stuff. They're going to rely on trunk motion, kind of in this. It'd be sagittal plane, but there is no planes. Everything moves on helix. But to simplify it, we'll call it the sagittal plane. Okay. So kind of understanding those in their body, and then that's going to be set up from the initial ground forces, kind of helps you understand the KPI for each guy a little bit more. So that may be, a guy's doing more rotational med ball throws, so they're doing more overhead with kind of a stomp on the front leg. Kind of all goes back to kind of what you said, the individual aspects of it. But the body movement is also going to create the arm movement and, where you're creating pressures on the ball through the hand to create the arsenal.
How much does having all the data you get from the tech, not only in here, but in the weight room, help buy-in from your athletes, being able to sit there and say, this is the stuff we're looking at, so that means we need to work on this? How much more helpful has that been in your experience with the buy-in from the athlete?
Yeah, it's huge. So here's something you run into sometimes is guys getting bigger, stronger in the weight room, jump momentum going through the roof, or other KPIs we're looking at and our jump force weights, right? But it may not be transferring on here or in the lab and ultimately in the game setting, okay? Is that's where we can actually distill this down. All right, hey, the horsepower is great enough, okay, but the productivity or the actual output on the mound is not where we need, and that's where we got to kind of pivot philosophy. So that's where that's really helpful, because guys come in with their mental model of what strength conditioning looks like for baseball, just bigger, stronger, faster, which is definitely part of it. But for some guys, that may be the strategy for 6-8 years. For some guys, it may be 2 to 3, and then there's a pivot. And that's where I kind of made mistakes too in the past, where maybe like, okay, freshman or a player comes in, they get up to these like strength values, then we change and pivot the focus. Well, it's like, the more finer way of doing that would be to actually relate it back to this and let us know, hey, there's still more to chase in there, or hey, it's time to pivot. I think those are the instances where that's really helpful in terms of educating the guys, right? Because here's the other thing that happens too sometimes. Guys that aren't performing well, they want to feel good about something, so they just want to go ham in the weight room.
Mm-hmm.
And then you suck on the field right now. Now you're going to suck even more because you're doing something that's making you worse.
Sure.
So that goes back to the education. And that's not on the player. Right. That's on me and not educating them well enough, okay?
Right.
We're finding the window where they can push something hard, but it's still going to help us on here, but they also get the kind of the self-esteem effect of making themselves feel good when they just had a couple bad outings or they've had a negative trend for a little while.
Sure. The college baseball calendar is unique because there isn't really a true off season with summer ball thrown in there. How do you kind of break down what strength and conditioning looks like and the training aspects look like throughout the year? When you split it from fall to kind of that weird 6-week winter, and then competition season going into summer.
Yeah, we've done it a bunch of different ways here. And I think a lot of it's been predicated upon how many guys we're throwing during the summer. So if we had a lot of guys that weren't, like, that could shift when we're kind of starting the fall scrimmages and kind of when we have more of an off season. Sometimes we've had like a little bit of kind of off season build up. Sometimes we've gotten into scrimmages quickly and then we have more of an off season at the end. So I think a lot of that just kind of depends on your team dynamic, like how many new guys you got coming in, especially the arms that, you could take some time to build up, and how many guys through during the summer. So, just work closely with our staff and kind of look at those things year to year in terms of what's the best for this particular group. Because here's the other thing too, rosters are changing, much greater rate than they have in the past. So there's also benefit to having some time to work with guys before we kind of throw them right into game type settings. But there's also benefit to doing that, and then you have more time on the back end. So we've been able to shift and pivot on that pretty well. But sometimes we have this is where communication with the staff is great. Work with Coach Backus and the entire staff. Understand what each guy needs during the summer. Some guys, best to stay here to train. We also have the lab, stuff like that could also be used. Some guys it's best, especially the hitters, then they get at bats if they haven't. Or it's just kind of, it goes back to the end of one, is like, what's the lowest hanging fruit for this guy? What's going to help them? What holds them back? And being able to really center in on each player for that.
Rick, appreciate your time this morning.
Yeah.
Thank
Great.
you.